All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining this talk. I mentioned to a few people earlier, we are going to do some demos up on the screen. I've got them pretty zoomed in, but if you squint looking at the screen, you might want to pop up a row or two. But like I said, we'll be zoomed in. We're going to have a good time. We're talking about the navigation API today. This is going to be fun. Let's go ahead and dive right in. If you are the kind of person that likes to look at the slides while I'm walking through them, you'll get all the spoilers, but also you can kind of flip through them at your own pace. You can hit the URL down there at the bottom, or you can hit that QR code. Both of them will take you to the slides that I'm about to walk through. And at the end of the slides, which you'll see at the end of the talk, there's links out to the demos I'm going to show too. So you'll have access to all of those things. This is already up on my website, and I'll post about it on Blue Sky as well after all of this. So we'll make sure you have those resources. All right, so where are we going to go today? So we're going to be talking about the new navigation API. We're going to be talking about the problem that it solves. We're going to be talking about kind of the shape of it. What is it? How does it work kind of at a very high level? And then the majority of our time is going to be looking through a series of demos that will progressively kind of build up our understanding of what it does, how it can be used, and some of the things you need to know if you're going to be working with it in a practical way. A little bit about me before we get started. So my name is Gesualdo. I'm mostly from the Atlanta area. Technically, I'm a transplant, but I've been here for most of my life. Married with a 5-year-old son and a 2-year-old daughter, so they keep us very busy. I've been a software engineer for 10 years, but I've been working in what I call like web-adjacent tech for 19. Prior to doing front-end engineering, I was still working with the web, just not quite in that like engineering capacity. So I do full stack work, but I've been focusing a lot on the front end lately. I'm very passionate about developer experience, about tooling, about build processes and build systems, CI, all of those things. You can find me everywhere online at Gesualdo, so that's GitHub. My website's raygesualdo.com. I'm that on Blue Sky. I'm Gesualdo on Twitter, although I don't spend too much time there anymore. So you can reach out to me. And LinkedIn too. So I am Gesualdo everywhere. We can connect, have more discussions about this or anything else tech related. Would love to do that with y'all. Shout out to SalesLoft, the company that I work at. I currently serve as a staff software architect on the front end enablement team. And I've been there for a little over 6.5 years, and they sponsored me to come here. So thank you, SalesLoft, for that. So what is it? The navigation API. I just screenshot this from MDN because it says it very succinctly. So this is the only time I will read directly off of a picture, but I will do it because, again, it's very succinct. The navigation API provides the ability to initiate, intercept, and manage browser navigation actions. And, yes, I'm going to delve into that. The problem that it solves, let's start there, because if I start to talk about all the great things about it, it helps to have the context of what are the painful things about navigating in the browser right now. So one thing I want to one kind of note about this is that this is specifically for client-side navigations that you typically see in a single-page app. If you're doing your typical like multi-page application, server-rendered pages, things of that nature, you wouldn't be using this. This is strictly for client-side applications, single-page apps, sometimes called SPAs or SPAs. And now, if you are using one of those and you've ever had to do any routing, and not talking about like pulling in a third-party router, but actually doing some routing in the browser directly, what you will notice is that it's painful. It is. And the reason for that there are a few reasons for that. One of them is that there is no universal navigation event handling. There is no way prior to this API where you could just say window.addEventListener URL or whatever, history or what have you, and get every single navigation change that the browser is going to make. There were like one or two you could cobble together, but it would still only get you about 60% of the different navigations. Things like if you hit the back button on the browser, or, if you got one of those mice where you can hit the button or, you swipe back and forth on your trackpad, it wouldn't capture those events. A lot of little idiosyncrasies that made it really difficult to consider or to use any of those events with any sort of consistency. However, this new API is going to solve that. We'll look at that here in a little bit. The other thing too is the history.pushState API is really awkward. And I always forget the signature, but it's like history.pushState, and then you have to give like the title of the page you're going to go to, and then the state that you want to keep in memory, which we almost never do, and then finally the path you want to go to. It's very clear that that API was not created for client-side navigation, even though it does enable it kind of under the hood for all of the routing libraries that we pull in. And then what this has led to is that there are a lot of user land implementations. So if you're using a JavaScript framework like Next or TanStack Router or React Router, or if you're outside of the React space, if you're using Vue with Vue Router or Angular, or any of these, Svelte even, if you're using any of these frameworks, they all have a different routing implementation, which also means none of them talk to each other, which for the most part is not a problem. But if you've ever had to get two routers to talk to each other, which I unfortunately have had the pleasure of doing in some of my work, you'll notice that it's very difficult. And I had to actually like hack into Angular to get it talking to a React router. And it was a mess because there was no centralized way for them to communicate. This API, again, solves some of that. And I've actually had discussions with some of those router library implementers, and they are very excited about this API because it's going to simplify a lot of the code that they have to write. In many ways, removing whole sections of their code, and they'll just be able to build on top of what's already there in the browser. So if that's the problem it solves, how do we actually use it? So if you have a Chromium-based browser, you can crack open the DevTools right now and do window.navigation and hit enter, and you'll get that navigation API object that comes right from the browser itself. Now there's a lot of things on there. There's some properties, some methods. We're going to talk about three primarily today, and so I want to highlight those here. So the first is navigation.navigate, which does exactly what you'd expect it to do. You give it a path, and it does a client-side navigation to that path. So no more history.pushState where you have to organize the parameters in a specific way. You can just say navigate, go. There's also ways to optionally say whether you want to navigate via what's called a push or a replace. And what it's talking about there is the history stack. Do I want to replace the current point in history, or do I want to push a new event so that they can actually use the back button to come back to this page? So you can provide some options there in the navigate function, but its primary job is to say, okay, here's a path, go there. The second one is add event listener, and this is where we get that consistent, unified way to listen to literally every single route change in the entire application, with the one exception of cross-domain navigations, meaning if I'm on example.com and I click a link that takes me to google.com, that event listener isn't going to fire because it's a cross-domain request. But if it's any link inside of example.com, this event listener is going to pick it up, and it gives us the opportunity to interact with it, manage it, do all sorts of fun things, which we'll see once we get to our demos. And then lastly, one of the data properties, or one of the properties on navigation, is .currentEntry, which tells you exactly where you're at in the history. And then there's the history stack. You can go back, you can go forward, things like that. But these three are the primary ones that we'll be looking at in our demos today as well. And really with these three, you can get 95, 98% of the value out of this API. So the add event listener, right? So anytime we add an event listener, we receive some sort of event in the callback. In this case, there is a new event type called navigation event, capital N, capital E, right? And so this event object has lots of different properties. Again, I'll let you go ahead and dig into the browsers and dig into adding this on your own. You can kind of see some of those come across. But one of the most interesting aspects of this event is it has a method called intercept. And if you call that method, this is where we can actually tell the browser, hey, hold on 1 second. We want to do something special with this navigation. Don't treat this like a normal multi-page app navigation. And when we get into our demos, that's where we'll see a lot of the, it's not magic because it all makes sense once we tease it apart, but that's where all the interesting stuff happens once we get there. So I'm going to jump over to demos. We're going to kind of slowly build up our understanding of what each of these things can do. So the demos are going to look very similar as we go, but the JavaScript controlling or interacting with these demos will change, and we'll delve into what that looks like as we go. So the first one I wanted to do here, all we're going to do is we're going to explore that navigation event object. I said that there's a lot of properties on it. We're not going to look at all of them, but we'll look at all of the ones that really are interesting as it pertains to kind of custom routing. So if I try to go to fake page 1, this is an A tag, right? So if I crack open the HTML, I'm not using any frameworks here. I'm not using React or Svelte or Vue. This is all just static HTML. And this is an A tag with an href. That's all we're doing here. So nothing special. All right, if I click on that, few things we get from the navigation event. And we're going to run through them, and we'll see kind of how some of these values change depending on the type of link you click. So the first value is can intercept. So this will always be true unless it's a cross-domain request, in which case the browser's not going to let you do any intercepting or anything. It's just going to fire the event and move on. Destination tells us where we're going to. URL is going to be the fully qualified URL, so you can use the URL constructor to parse that out and get different pieces and parts of it. And then we also know whether or not it's going to be a same document navigation. Things like, did I click an anchor with just an ID and I just need to go up or down the page, right? I may not want to do any sort of intercepting in that case. I may just want to let the browser do its thing. We have some other things that can happen as a part of a navigation request. If there's a link with the download tag or download attribute on it, then download request is going to be not null. And the value of that depends on some properties of the link itself. If we've done a form post, we'll actually see things in form data. For hash change, that's if the hash in the URL has changed. The navigation type, I mentioned earlier that you can either do a push or a replace. There's technically, I think, 4. There's push, replace, reload. I can't remember the fourth one, but it's not very common. So it'll tell you what kind of navigation type this is. You can also, if you've ever used promises, you can actually do this with event listeners too. There's a constructor in JavaScript called an abort signal, where you can call it up, you can pass it to some sort of asynchronous work, and then if you want to cancel that work for some reason, you can call the signal and it'll actually abort the work for you. It'll stop it from continuing. Navigation events have that same sort of asynchronous cancellation built in, just like promises do and event listeners do. And then lastly, user initiated, true or false. And this one has some subtleties to it, so we'll look at that moving forward. User initiated, I clicked fake page number 1, so it is user initiated. So if I click through fake page number 2 and number 3, the only thing that changes is the URL. Everything else stays the same because these are just regular A tags. Now, if I click on download link, and what this is it's a normal A tag that just has a download attribute on it. If I click on that, it changes the download request, so download request is not null. It also, on that A tag, I gave, and I can actually click into this, and we can take a quick look. Inspect. That A tag has a download attribute, and a download attribute, you can either just put it there bare, or you can give it a file name and tell the browser, hey, when you download this file, download it as this, right? So in this case, I'm telling it to download as some file.pdf, and we can see that the download request matches that name. If I'm going to go to the top or the bottom, and so these are just hash changes, right, where these are anchor tags with just IDs in them, then I can click on top. The URL does change, right? So we see that the top ID is in there, but same document is now true. And hash change is true, right? And then going to the bottom is the exact same. The only thing that changes is the anchor itself. But there are other navigations we can use in the browser straight from HTML. Things like a form GET request or a form POST request, buttons, things of that nature, right? So if we submit a GET form and we submit this, we can see now when you submit a form using a GET action, it'll stringify the parameters and it'll stick that in the URL. So we can see that right there, right? Where name is Ray. If I change this to Bob or Bobo and hit submit, we can see that Bob is in here too, right? Well, if I post data, right? So if I change this to Claire, right? And I hit submit. So now the URL does not have a name in it anywhere. It's actually pointing to where this form is going to post data. But we do see our form data. Now, I cheated a little bit. This is actually a capital F, capital D form data object that the browser gives you. They don't serialize, so I hacked it into JSON, but this would give you the actual form data object that you can work with. Then if we do a reload, excuse me, we can see we're going right to the exact same page we were at, but our navigation type has changed from push to reload. And interestingly, if we do have any code that still relies on that history.push state being called programmatically, boop, it's still being caught by this one universal handler. So even if you have code that is, I can't even call it legacy because it's really the only way to do this cross-browser right now, right? If you're using history.push state, this new listener will handle that as well. You can handle this all in a centralized fashion. And so one thing I did want to point out though, user initiated, all right? So when I clicked on history.push state, user initiated was false, which doesn't seem to make sense because I clicked a button, all right? But one thing that's happening here for both the reload and the history.push state, these are being, when I click on them, I have JavaScript listeners that when that click happens, triggers window.reload or history.push state. So technically what's happening is a programmatic navigation. So that's not user initiated. Anytime I'm submitting a form post or a form get, those are user initiated. Just clicking a normal link, those are user initiated because I click it and the browser is handling that user interaction. But technically, because the reloads and the history.push states are being proxied through JavaScript, they're not user initiated. So that's that subtlety there. I'll pause here. Any questions before we continue? Douglas, any questions? No? Okay. Douglas is good. So we're going to keep on going. All right. So we started with our little paddle boat here. We're going to move up to a sailboat. So our understanding of the navigation API is increasing. We're moving a little faster. All right. So let's see what we're going to learn for this one. Okay. So everything on this page is still the same minus the history.push state. So let's talk through what's going to happen here. So if I click on this link, nothing happens. If I click on download link, it downloads. If I go to the top or the bottom, it works. All right, so these page links from the previous demo, they're not working for some reason. Let's figure out why. If I post a form, or I'm sorry, if I do the get form, that doesn't work. The post form works. I wonder why. And the reload doesn't work. Maybe there's something going on in the JavaScript that will explain this odd behavior compared to the previous demo. Here we go. All right, so if you go to, I can't remember if it's the MDN article or the original Chrome dev blog article, but one of the things that they will highlight is that the first thing you want to do if you're building this from scratch is figure out which events you don't want to listen to. And so that's what I did here in this one. And we'll talk about why you probably don't want to care about these specific events. So this right here, window.navigation.addEventListener for the navigate event. This is all we have to do to start listening to those navigation events. Now in our case, the first thing we're doing is we're doing a check where if we should not intercept this event, we just go ahead and return early. Otherwise, we prevent the event from continuing, right? So event.prevent default is a common standard way in JavaScript to say this event doesn't need to continue. And that's how we can actually bail on the navigation, right? So we're still using very standard JavaScript here. Now, what should we not intercept? Well, the first thing is, it should, do we have that can intercept value? Now, again, the only time that's ever false is when it's a cross-origin navigation, which the browser won't let you intercept anyway. So we put it there just because, but it really practically wouldn't make a difference. What does make a difference is hash change. So if we're just changing anchors on the page and we want the browser to naturally move the user up and down, we don't want to intercept those. We just want to let those go through. If the user is downloading something, we probably don't want to intercept that either. Now, again, you can. So if you want to do something interesting there, you have that potential. But for the most part, we probably don't. And then lastly, if there is form data, meaning if this is an actual form post, we probably don't want to intercept that either. We just want to let that continue onto the server, let the server handle it, and provide us with a response. Now, again, these are suggested defaults. Your situation may look different. So you may say, yes, I actually do want to intercept download requests because I want to do something very specific with them. Great, go ahead and do that. But I would say for 99.9% of use cases, this is a good place to start from in terms of understanding what do I want to intercept and what don't I want to intercept. intercept. Any questions here? All right. Hannah, any questions from you? No, we good? Oh, you want to wait? Okay. Wait till demo 5. Then you can unleash them all. All right. So again, we had our sailboat. We're moving on to the speedboat, right? We got demo number 3. Let's talk about what we're going to see here. And this is where we can actually start programmatically doing something interesting when we intercept an event, right? So these like other elements, the forms, we're not really going to mess with those too much through the rest of these demos, so I just went ahead and hid those. But what is, these bottom 3, actually all of these links are still valid. Now, the reason that the ones prior said fake page and these now say page is that, like, if I were to open this up in a new tab, right? So command click, this is an actual HTML snippet, right? So this is pointing to a real page. But we're going to do something interesting with it. What are we going to do? Well, when I click page number 1, let's see what happens. Doot. So we went and we got some data and we popped it into the page. So if you've ever used anything like TurboLinks or HTMX or anything like this is going to feel very familiar. And I'm sure you're going, this is not interesting. You're right. We'll get to more interesting things in a minute, but we need to build up some of this intuition of how this is working before we get there. So all I'm doing right here is I'm pulling in the content from those HTML snippets and injecting it into this page. Now, you'll notice nothing about the URL changes. The only thing that's happening is that this content is being injected. So let's look at how that's happening. And again, like the go to top and go to bottom, those still work just exactly the same, because when we look at our JavaScript source, you'll notice we still maintain our should not intercept function from the previous demo. So we're keeping that, and we're going to build on that code. So I said before that event.destination.url is a fully qualified URL. So you can pass that to the URL constructor, and it'll parse it out for you. It'll give you the origin. It'll give you the protocol. It'll give you the port and the path name and any search queries or search params, right? So the only thing we really care about is the path name. So I say, great, we've got the path name. If it includes pages, so I'm kind of filtering down just to the links that I care about. If it includes pages, let's go ahead and prevent the default. We don't want it to actually do the navigation, right? We don't want it to navigate to this bare piece of HTML. We want to do something different. And all we do is we fetch that URL, or technically the path name, but we could fetch the whole URL if we wanted to. We grab the text for it, and then we inject that text that we fetched right into the page. So again, very vanilla JavaScript we're working with here, right? This is how something like HTMX or TurboLinks works, right? You say, I want to navigate to the page A, and it reaches out to page A, grabs that HTML, sticks it into some place in the existing DOM. And fancier libraries will do things like handle event listeners and set up and tear down and things like that. But for our use case, this is exactly what's happening. So this is demo number 3. All we're doing, again, is grabbing content from an external source, pulling it in. And this is starting to feel a little bit like a single page app. Let's go to demo 4. This is where things start to get a little more interesting. So if I hit page 1, page 2, page 3, we're still pulling in that data. But if you'll notice, in the URL, and I don't know the shortcut to zoom in on a Mac, in the URL, it no longer says demo04. It now says /pages/1 and /pages/2 and /pages/3. So we've moved now, not only are we asynchronously pulling in this content like you would have in a single page application, but now we're actually affecting the URL bar, right? So this is getting us that kind of fully fleshed out routing system that we're so used to with our libraries and our frameworks. So what does that look like? Again, we're building on what we did last time. We still have path name. We're still saying, okay, are we working with that pages path? But here, instead of just calling event.prevent default and then doing something else, here we're going to call event.intercept. And the moment we do that, what we're telling the browser is, we still want you to change the URL bar. We're still going to make a quote unquote navigation, but I'm going to let you know how I want you to handle that. And so the code in here is exactly the same as we had in the last demo. I switched from chained promises to async await. So if you're maybe less familiar with async await, that's all that's happening there. But the code is essentially the exact same. The only difference is that we have called event.intercept, which takes an object, a few things you can put in here, but again, the main thing is a handler, where you say, here's how I want to handle this intercepted URL event. So if we come over to here again, we're just clicking through the URL changes, and we can prove the URL changes because if I just do a page reload with the Command R, we get the actual HTML page, right? So if I try to go back in the browser, it's going to take me forever because I actually have the browser stack of all the pages I went through, so it's taking me back through, and then there we go. I'm back to the demo. So our history stack is being updated. Our navigations are being intercepted, and we're handling them the way we want to. Now, again, for a fully fleshed out solution, if the user was to reload the page on pages/1, you'd want to do all the work to make sure that it's the normal HTML page with pages 1's content in there instead of this, right? That's beyond a little bit of what we're looking to do today. But let's pop over to 5. This is where everything really comes home, right? So we've got our page links. We've got a lot more buttons this time. We're going to kind of play around for a little bit. We have the ability to enable a progress bar. Let's see what some of this looks like. So if I just click page 1, again, content pops in just like it was on the previous demo. When I hit page 2 now has a slight delay, and you'll actually see it waits for a second, and then the code pops in. It's only about 500 milliseconds, so it'll still happen fast. I clicked, kind of takes a minute, and then there it is. And by a minute, I mean 500 milliseconds. Now, if I hit page 3, this one has a 5-second delay. So if I click that, it says it's loading, it's loading, it's loading. It takes it a few seconds, and then finally, there it is. Now, something that may have not been readily apparent when I did that, I'm going to go back to page 1. I'm going to click on page 3 again, and this is the one with the 5-second delay. Watch what happens to my reload button, and watch what happens to the icon in the browser. Again, if you can see that, watch what happens. I now have an X in the browser, and the icon on my tab is spinning, just like it would be if I was doing a normal multi-page navigation. This is something that none of the current routing solutions can do because the browser doesn't provide any sort of primitives for React Router to tell the browser that a navigation is occurring. But with this new navigation API, what we're telling the browser is as soon as we call event.intercept, the browser says, okay, I know you are intending to make a navigation. I'll go ahead and put the browser into a loading or a pending state, meaning I get the X up there, I get the loading spinner on the tab, and then once the handler is fully, especially if it's an async function, right? Once that promise has been fulfilled or throws, then I'll go ahead and kick it back into we're done. So when I go to 2, it does that same thing. Now, this is even more apparent when we do things like enable a progress bar. So I can click onto page 3, and we can see we're tracking that progress. It's not a smart progress bar, so it just waits a little bit till it's done and then pushes it across, right? But this works also with redirects, right? So for page number 4, we can redirect to page 1. So even though I clicked the link for page 4, and it's hard to see down here, but the link for page number 4 is /pages/4. In our code, we're telling it, we actually want you to go to page number 1. And this is a very common practice, right? You've deprecated some page, you've got a new page that replaces it. You say, okay, point page A to now page B. What does all this look like? Surprisingly, not too much code. And this is the whole point of the navigation API. It does a little bit more, so we're going to walk through it, but not too much. Now, I didn't include the code for the progress bar. That is included in the source code for this. All this is open sourced and will be linked to in the slides, so you can explore that a little bit more. What I'm focusing here is just on the page navigations. All right, so we still have our should not intercept. We're still pulling out the path name. Great. Now, the first thing we do is we say, okay, if the path name is pages/4, we're going to go ahead and call a navigation, or we're going to call the navigate function, point it to page 1, and we want to go ahead and do a replace so that page 4 is never in the history stack. And as soon as we call navigation.navigate, all of this happens again, right, for page 1, and the browser will stop executing anything below navigation.navigate, right? So it's as if we called return. Right, so that's how we handled the redirect for from page 4 to page 1. Now, everything else from here below looks very similar. We've got our path.includes to make sure we're filtering on the right pages. We call intercept, which we pass an async handler. And here's where we say, okay, if it's page 3, we go ahead and delay 500 milliseconds. Oh, I'm sorry, if it's page 2, delay 500 milliseconds. If it's page 3, we're going to delay for 5,000 milliseconds, but here's also where we very imperatively for this demo say, okay, go ahead and provide some sort of loading indicator in the content. And then everything after that is exactly the same from the previous demos. So with just a few lines of code, we can do redirects. And again, you could do something like have an array of paths, right? Where you can check the array of paths with a from and a to value. You wouldn't have to necessarily list every single one here. And if you're using some sort of front-end framework, there's probably ways that you can more idiomatically express this. But if you're doing it in just plain JavaScript, then you could do it this way. We can do our intercept and our handler. Should not intercept is exactly the same, and delay is just a promise-based or a promise-based wrapper around set timeout, right? So we're delaying, and what this again gives us, these go to page 1, 2, and 3. This is calling the navigation.navigate API. So if I go to page 1, all of this operates exactly the same. It doesn't matter if it's an A tag, like this is up here. It doesn't matter if I'm navigating to it programmatically, like I am with these buttons, right? Go to page 2, have the exact same delay. Go to page 3, I'm gonna have that 5-second delay, where it first flashes in the loading indicator, in this case just text, and then eventually resolves. All right, now the difference between these buttons, go to and sneak to, is that the sneak tos do a history.replace. So if I press these, go to page 1, and then go to page 2, if I hit the back button, I'm not going to go to page 1, I'm going to go to page 3, because I went from 3, and then I sneaked to 1 and sneaked to 2. Is that the right verb? Sort of a deal. So it doesn't matter whether you're navigating via a third-party library. It doesn't matter if you're navigating via JavaScript. It doesn't matter if you're navigating via built-in HTML elements like the A tag and the form. All of this can still be in a single place, listened to, interacted with, managed, canceled, all sorts of different interactions that we can do with these events. Now that's the last demo. We're going to talk about some of the other things you can do with this navigate event. But before we pop over there, any questions about the demo? Hannah, you said you'd have some later. Do you have any right now? No? Okay.
I mean, we talked about it a little bit. I was originally curious about the query workings, but it looks like that's handled as part of this as well. We can all that like search queries can be passed through.
Absolutely, yeah. So any search params, that's a good question. So if you're providing any sort of search params, whether it's kind of statically on an A tag or if you're doing a form submission with a get method, where would those query params be? Those query params would be right here on .url, which again is just a full string. But when you pass it to the URL constructor, it's going to give you these search params as I think it gives you as an object, or maybe a URL search params object. I can't remember which, but it will give them to you in a structured fashion for you to interact with. So I could just as easily here be destructuring search params alongside path name and have access to both of those, which then I can key off of it. So if you're doing any sort of like, maybe you have a list view of data and your filters change the query params in the URL, you could easily pull those out and have those affect your data fetching logic. Great question. Any others before we move on? All right, let's talk about some of the other things that this can do. So there's much more to explore far beyond what we could cover in this session here. So things that you can do with the navigation API that are very interesting. Things like transitions. If you've been, if you're kind of ear to the ground to web standards, you might have heard about the View Transitions API, which kind of gives you single page application-like transitions, but when it's a multi-page app. You can hook into those. You could also just hook into kind of Java, kind of your typical single page app transitions. And you can key off of, okay, when does the navigation start? When does it end? There are additional navigation of event types. So all we did was look at add event listener or for the navigate event. But there's also, you can also listen to navigation start, navigation end, I think navigation error, I think are at least 3 of them. So you can handle those things differently. And I think the progress bar is using navigation start and navigation end. So if you dig into the open source code, you'll see some of those being used, right? So there are a lot of different pieces and parts of the navigation lifecycle we can listen for. We can trigger transitions. We can make sure those transitions end at the right point. We can also cancel navigations. I mentioned earlier that you can pass what's called an abort signal, an abort controller, to these navigation events. So you can say, and actually the easiest way to see this happen is try to navigate somewhere with a little bit of a delay, and then hit the X in the browser, right, to cancel the page navigation. That'll immediately cancel the navigation. We can also do it programmatically too with the abort controller. And then we can handle those in our code and say, oh, if the user stopped moving forward, well then go ahead and stop doing this data fetching, cancel this transition, things like that. We can kind of clean up what might have been happening en route to our new page. There's more information on the navigation object. And I said there were a lot of properties. We really only looked at 3 at the beginning. A few other ones on there are navigation.state. This is if you want to keep any data kind of in memory. This isn't used very much anymore. It used to be used, I think, a lot by AngularJS with its router, but most, yeah, I'm getting some head nods. It was used a lot by AngularJS's router, so like the 1.x branch. Most routing solutions don't really make use of it anymore, but it's still there if you want to use it. There's all sorts of information about where you're at. There's information about the history stack, so you can actually search through the stack and see what pages people have looked at. You can go back. You can go to a specific index on the stack. You can do all sorts of those sorts of things right off of that navigation object. There's also a consistent way to do navigation blocking. Now this is, I'm not a fan of this. There are certain times when it does make sense from a UX perspective. Perhaps someone's filling out a very long form and there's no like autosave feature, and they navigate away, or they attempt to navigate away, and you want to let them know, hold on now, you just took 10 minutes filling out this form. Do you really want to navigate away and lose all this information? Right now, there's some hacks you have to do to make sure that it catches that event well, and it's a little ugly. You can actually do navigation blocking in a very centralized fashion with the new navigation API. You can do it, again, all inside of that event listener. So I highly recommend checking out on MDN. All of the docs there are great. Lots of examples. They'll give you a lot more information about what's available. So some resources based off what we talked about today, the demos, excuse me, that I walked through, all those are up online for you to click through on your own. The demo source code is publicly available on GitHub. The MDN navigation API docs are great. Highly recommend looking into them. If you are a glutton for punishment, you can actually go look at the actual spec docs. Those are, I couldn't parse through those. Those were a little too much for me. But if you like that sort of thing, feel free. They'll go through all the little bits and pieces of what this can do. And then the Chrome dev blog had a post when this kind of first came out around modern client-side routing, what it could do, why it was created. That was somewhat of a genesis for this talk. So thank you so much for going through this with me. Cutting edge browser tech and browser APIs are always so interesting. They give us such a great view into what's coming down the line, even if we can't use them today. What this API affords us is really powerful and really incredible, considering where we started and what we have in the browser today versus what this is going to bring us. So even if you're not using routers or writing a router library right now, hopefully this will give you a sneak peek of what is coming and what will be possible. Thank you so much for joining.